our assessment subcommittee meeting.
I think Danielle wants to wait a second.
Who? Danielle. Oh.
She went to go find you.
That's okay. She went to go find me? Oh. I reorganized the agenda a little bit, and I passed out to you the new agenda. And we have two major things to talk about today. And I want the subcommittee to inform the department regarding the RFI, and you've got a draft before you, as well as working with decisions on transition so that we can get started on that actual process. So we're going to begin with Michelle McGowan. She's going to talk about the roles. Oh, is she here? I just noticed she's not in the room.
She's with Danielle.
Oh, they're both out there looking for me. She's going to talk about the roles of our subcommittee and ethics on RFI and RFP process. You may, yeah, just join us. Please do.
Sure. We were looking for you, actually.
Oh, that's
So
okay.
apologize.
I went the back way. I went to the other restroom.
So on Friday, staffs for the board and the department met, and everyone thought collectively it would be a good use of time to kind of just walk through once again what the statutory roles and responsibilities of the various entities are. And then just have a high-level discussion about the ethical practices related to procedures, because we know many of the test manufacturers might start reaching out and wanting to have conversations. So similar to with the standards, the Education Roundtable has statutory roles and responsibilities related to the recommendation of assessments. In fact, if we think back to our, I guess it's only been a week and a half, but the last board meeting where we were talking about the board's vote and on standards, and I said, well, there's a 2004 Attorney General opinion that has indicated that it needs to be a straight up or down vote. That actually stems from an Education Roundtable recommendation about assessments, cut scores. So the processes are very similar. But I just threw on the slide the language itself, but again, it will go to the roundtable first, and then the board would adopt. And again, it would be an up or down vote without the kind of flexibility to make changes or modify. If the board did not agree with the recommendation, then the idea is that there would be a thorough discussion so that if the roundtable met again, they would be clued into what the concerns were. And then 2032-54 is the statute that really addresses the role of the board and the superintendent and the department. And I color-coded these trying to be helpful. So blue is the state board. The state board has the role of authorizing the overall development and implementation of the, here it says I-STEP, but it'll be the assessment system as we move forward from I-STEP.
So can I ask you a question based upon what we just amended, the last resolution from the roundtable? So when we put in and approval, does that mean that we're going to have some type of approval process at the roundtable and then it comes to the board?
I'm sorry.
I'm speaking of our last, in our board meeting. I'm talking about in our board meeting.
The curricular material manual?
Correct.
Okay, so you're asking how the process will work if it's, so I had understood Dr. Freitas's requested amendment to be that the curricular manual would come, yeah, so it want approval. So yeah, it would go back first to the roundtable. I'm looking at Dan. Well, I'm talking about just she's asking about the resolution. Okay, okay. Well, it's new. I don't think, I wasn't anticipating it. Okay.
So the roundtable would review it, but the board would do some kind of vote
Yeah.
on it? Okay, I just want to be clear as to how that's all going to work, because it says, well, shall be submitted to the roundtable and the board for review and approval. So I just want to be sure that it was the board that was wanting to take some action, not the roundtable that was going to take some action. So, okay. All right.
So switching back to assessment, and obviously these are interrelated. The state board authorizes the overall assessment system, basically. And then from that authorization, or within those parameters, the superintendent is responsible for the development, implementation, and monitoring, and then the department prepares the detailed design. And so we have Dr. Walker here beside me who can talk about that process, and she knows it as well as anyone. But I color-coded those because each of these entities have a distinct and separate role, but they all are important in terms of achieving the overall assessment system. Right.
I don't want to read into more that's there, because I appreciate trying to distinguish between the duties. I just want to understand. So when it says the board authorizes the development, I can read that one way to just say the board just says, okay, develop it. Or does the board have more input into the shape, structure, nature? Because when you get down to the department, it clearly says they design detailed specifications, but is that based on direction set by the board, or how do I interpret authorize the development and implementation of?
So I think that it gives the board a little bit of discretion, right? So because it says authorize, the board could authorize and give kind of carte blanche to the department to develop an assessment system using its best judgment in the superintendent, right? Or it could be, we are authorizing the development of an assessment system that it does X, Y, and Z. Broader policy initiatives. And then the superintendent and the department would then be limited to those parameters. So I think that there's some flexibility there, but in terms of how much the board would be involved in drawing parameters in terms of policy versus just kind of giving carte blanche.
Agreed, but the board could, in its authorization, define some attributes, and then from that, the design stays inside that box.
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions? And I think as we're going to talk about this process, we're starting with the RFI before the RFP, and I think the whole reason of doing that is to try to give some information about what the options would be in terms of parameters. So as vendors respond and do presentations from the RFI, the request for information, that is a fact-gathering, information-gathering process to learn about the options for what the assessments could do, what they might look like. Then we would draft an RFP that would be more narrowly tailored, more specific. The RFI, as you receive drafts of it, right now is pretty broad. It doesn't get into specifics of whether you're going to have, say, a state mandated assessment that serves the, right, so let's back up. As Dr. Walker explained last time, in Indiana, we have our 10th grade assessment that's state mandated, and then we have our ECAs, our end of course assessments in Algebra 1, Biology 1, and English 10. English 10 and Algebra 1 serve as what used to be the GQE, right? So we haven't, the panel's talked about it, the accountability panel, but there hasn't been a lot of discussion in terms of, by the board or others, we definitely want to see the state assessment also serve the role of the GQE, for example, right? Through the RFI process, as we receive vendor information about what the options are for making sure we're both getting assessments that allow us to calculate growth at the high school level, and assessments that can serve as a GQE, and assessments that can identify students who might need remediation prior to graduation. From that, we will would make policy decisions and draft an RFP that tries to solicit vendor information that would do those specific things, if that makes sense. So the RFI, you'll have different people who will say, oh, well, we could create a suite that just is a vertically aligned assessment for grades 9, 10, 11. And you might have a different one, vendor who says, well, we want to just offer a test that's purely about identifying students who need remediation. Or you might have a vendor who says, I can roll all of these into one assessment so that students aren't taking multiple assessments. And that's the purpose of the RFI, is to provide this sort of information about what the options are for assessment, and then after the board makes decisions about what they would like that to be, then we can draft an RFP that's very specific about what sort of assessment system Indiana is looking for, and vendors can respond precisely to that. And I think that that ties into what your question was, because that's sort of, again, about setting the parameters of what the assessment system would look like. So just a couple of really quick slides about ethical procedures and procurement. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, we're going to see vendors who want to have conversations with the board members, board staff, department staff, to provide information about their assessment. We always want to make sure that we're careful to not give anyone an unfair advantage. So just a reminder that the ethics provisions continue to apply. I put one on the slide, but there are many, and everyone on the board has had their ethics training, but this is a good opportunity to review all of the ethics provisions, but here is the conflict of interest language. In addition, there are some kind of broad rules. So during the RFI, IDOA will post that. It is possible that even after the RFI is posted, that decision makers and panel members would have conversations with test vendors. What we would want to recommend is that any of those be logged to create a record to ensure that no one vendor would have an advantage over another. Obviously, there's always the safe rule of thumb of just not having those conversations, but if you're going to have them, I would log the substance of the conversation and the length of the conversation. Responses to the RFI will remain confidential until the RFP is posted. So that is a process put in place by IDOA, and you can think about knowing the millions of dollars attached to these assessments. You can imagine why this is appropriate, because it could give other individuals an unfair advantage if they had access to what the information is of a different person's RFI response. But once the RFP is posted by IDOA, the rules change. At that point, you will no longer be able to have any kind of contact with vendors. And in case you're worried about what if we have a need for additional clarity of what they put in their RFP, IDOA serves as an intermediary. So if we reading the RFP something is unclear, or we think it requires some follow-up questions, IDOA will ask those questions of the vendor, that way to insulate us from the appearance of impropriety. So there is a mechanism to get additional information if it's needed, but board members and panel participants should not be having those conversations with vendors themselves. I think that's pretty much, those are the high-level pieces. I'm happy to answer questions, whether it's now or as we move forward, but I would recommend that that everyone review the ethics pieces. We sent that out a long time ago. It's just one page because it's on like size 4 font, but we'll just want to be careful. But the great thing is really IDOA does a lot of this for us, including the posting of the RFI and the RFP and asking those sorts of questions.
Any questions for Michelle? Thanks, Michelle. You may have to send that ethics back out.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
to members of the board that
Right,
aren't
I was
here
thinking-
today.
Right, because if you're not here today.
Sure.
Especially the part that, there's no contact with them once it's at the IDOA.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is, as we usually do, we'll post the PowerPoint, and then maybe what I should do is just create an embedded link when I say ethical code provisions, and that way people can click on it and easily pull that up and make this as useful as possible.
That'd be great.
Great.
Molly and Deb, I think we've invited you to give a quick review about accountability and how it actually ties with our assessment discussion. You can just come up and have a seat at the table. I believe you have a PowerPoint of their presentation.
Oh, I have the clicker. I'm sorry.
Clicker
I'm
quarter.
just standing here looking at you like, what's the holdup?
Well, thanks for having us this afternoon. We did want to stop by and chat about the accountability panel recommendations and how assessments will feed into that accountability system. So before you on your presentation, we do have a quick overview of the recommendation that was made by the accountability panel. If we move on to the accountability panel framework and assessments, the accountability framework recommendation includes performance and growth measures for each of the 5 following indicators: English language arts, math, reading, graduation, and college and career readiness. Of those 5 indicators, 3 of the indicators for both performance and growth will be derived from assessment data: English language arts, math, and reading. So as we move into the performance component of this, I do want to point out another sheet that was made available to you. This is actually a framework component page. Does everybody have this spreadsheet?
I believe I passed it out to everybody.
Yeah.
Do you have it, Carrie? It
So
looks
on
like
the spreadsheet-
this. Do you have it?
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
he has your copy.
Sorry.
So on the spreadsheet, we've limited this down to the performance and growth indicators. And for each of the indicators, we've outlined the different grade levels and what information is currently available. It's recommended that we include what we don't necessarily have a plan for yet, and what data is available and not being used in an accountability system. So we want to point this out as we go through this. If you look vertically down one of these grade levels or any of these grade levels, you'll notice that certain grade levels, let's take for example first grade and second grade, do not have any data components that feed accountability at this time. Nor do we have any data components that could feed accountability at this time. The same is also true for grade 9 and grade 11. So in other words, at this point, we don't have any test data for any of these grades. So let's get into performance. Performance indicators for English language arts, math, and reading for grades 3 through 8. The recommended metric is student achievement on standardized test options and student participation on those standardized tests, % of students participating in the annual assessments. So again, as we take a look back to our spreadsheet, you'll notice for grades 3 through 8 as well as 10, we do have this information available. For grades 1 and 2, 9 and 11, we do not have this information. Grade 12, of course, we also do not have any assessment information, but we do have graduation, college career readiness that reflect performance at grade 12. That takes us into the next slide, which is actually grades 9 through 11. And again, the recommended metrics here for student achievement, standardized test options, the achievement on the standardized test options, and for participation, % of students participating in annual assessments. I do also want to point out that the recommendation by the accountability panel was designed to be flexible and not built on the configuration of the school system. So in other words, one of the ideal outcomes of this accountability system would be to have a data component for every grade level, such that, let's take for example, our K through 2 schools actually has data to feed their accountability rating rather than utilizing a feeder model to assess that school. Feeder model essentially says we'll take the performance of the school, wherever the students go, and give those grades back to the feeder school. So in other words, at this time, we don't have any data components associated with a K2. We don't have any data components associated with a 9th grade academy to be able to assess that school on their performance.
So moving from performance onto growth, the accountability system needs to have both a measure of performance and a measure of growth. And so we'll talk a little bit about how does this go?
There you go.
Yay. We'll talk a little bit about the panel recommendations for growth, which are a little bit different from what we've been using right now. The panel has recommended looking at growth in multiple ways. First, there's a recommendation to look at categorical growth, so categorical status improvement. And this is really important to understand what this entails. In order to look at category growth, we must have multiple cut scores. So there's not just a did not pass, and a pass plus. We have different levels of did not pass, we have different levels of pass, and we have different levels of pass plus. So this actually allows a more granular view of what's happening at a student. And when you think about the I-STEP, the breadth of the did not pass category, it could encompass a student who's actually moving up and getting closer to passing, or a student who's pretty far down the spectrum. Pass is the same deal. You know, you could have a student who's actually passing at a higher level than another student. They're still hitting that bright line cut score, but there's different levels within these realms. And so what the categorical growth looks at, if you have, for example, a did not pass 1, a did not pass 2, a did not pass 3, and a pass 1, you can actually give schools credit for students moving up through those categories, or you can look at a school and assign a certain number of points if a student's moving down. It's a very easy mechanism for looking at, you know, how a student is doing and how a school is doing. It's very easy to explain to parents, but again, it's very important to understand that this does require multiple cut scores. Something else to consider when considering an assessment is looking at an actual assessment that might be able to identify additional skills that students are picking up across grade levels. Right now we do have a vertically scaled test, and that vertical score does mean something when you go from, say, a 425 in 3rd grade to a 450 in 4th grade. But we have an opportunity to make it even more meaningful. Right now, maybe for the first time in some areas, we have standards, we've just adopted standards today that are actually aligned across grade levels. And so we have an opportunity to look at a 3rd grade test in, say, English language arts and the skills that a student has, setting those cut scores in such a way that if a student moves to 4th grade to a different level of passing, that actually means that the student has obtained additional skills, for example, in the area of reading comprehension, or in the area of standards of conventions of standard English. So I think that's an opportunity that we have by virtue of the panel recommending the categorical growth. An additional measure of growth, we've looked at categorical, which is easy to see if a student is growing if they're changing categories, but also looking at the student's growth trajectory. Are they on track? So for example, if a student is staying within the pass category from one year to the next, we could say, well, they're still passing. That's good news. But in actuality, which way is the student going? Is the student headed in the right direction, or is the student not headed in the right direction? So this requires us to be able to look at least 2 years worth of data in order to actually start to make predictions about a student's trajectory and build in some growth scores associated with that. And Debbie, I don't know if you want to add anything to the targeted growth.
Sure. So targeted growth, what we're really looking at here is, as Molly was explaining, is being able to establish in those fine bands, even the finer bands under categorical growth, which direction that student's moving. We cannot refine that enough to be able to capture those small increments of movement within a band. If a student stays at this pass 1 band year after year, they can stay at that pass category, that pass 1 category, but they can start at the top of the band and at the very bottom of the band, such that they are on a trajectory where they will eventually fall below that that pass bright line into the did not pass category. So really being able to utilize the 2 components of growth, we hope to be able to capture every student, and again, be able to reward those students for those students that have crossed a boundary, either moving up or moving down, and also be able to capture the students that have not crossed the category line, but be able to assess which direction they're moving. Also, as Molly noted, we do need 2 consecutive years worth of assessments for any type of growth that we're looking at are these two components of growth, meaning that a student needs to test at one grade level first year, the next grade level the following year. If they test the same grade level, we cannot assess them for growth. When we're looking at 2 consecutive years worth of growth, that's that's a minimum. In previous years, we've used up to 5 previous years worth of data to be able to calculate standard growth percentiles in the Colorado growth model. As we limit the number of years worth of data, we're going to see more fluctuation. So when we get down to 2 years worth of data, we will see those students fluctuating a little more because we haven't established a strong pattern or a history of testing when we're looking at that growth. So it is something to keep in mind. When we get into the third version here, test level increase using 2 consecutive administrations of adaptive assessments. Options include fall to spring or spring to spring assessment. This is another option for testing and capturing growth. We can actually look at a grade level as an outcome of an assessment and look at 2 administrations of a test, again, whether it's spring to spring or fall to spring, to be able to establish how much that grade level has increased.
Just so I'm clear on that, I think I'm with you.
Yep.
I get the 2 consecutive years, but assuming a student continues to matriculate on schedule, it's more than 2 cumulatively that you're looking at, right? So we're actually looking at growth over every grade level. So it's not like we're looking at just 3 to 4 this year and then 4 to 5. It's not a band.
The recommendation has been to look at only 2 years worth of data for growth. So in other words, previously we have looked at multiple years to be able to assess growth and assess the student growth percentile. At this point, the recommendation to us has been to use only 2 years worth of data at any given time. So even if there is multiple years worth of data or multiple years of history, to look at only the current year and the previous year to establish growth.
Forgive me, but won't that create artificial skews in the data because of the fluctuation? I mean, it's going to be more radical if you're just looking at 2 years at any one given time versus performance over several years. I mean, I get that you need 2 to get started, but once they're moving, matriculating, you would expect to see the skew trim out, I would think, as you add additional years. So I don't get what was the rationale behind the ADEP panel on why they really ended up going to look at 2 years.
There's definitely a concern that has also been expressed by some of our experts on not including multiple years worth of data. I think the push to limit it to 2 years is for simplicity, to be able to look up in a lookup table and be able to establish if my student has this score this year and gets this score next year, they will definitely be whatever the label is, reach target, high growth, whatever we call it. So it was more of the call of simplicity, to be able to utilize only 2 years worth of data. I think that's still being vetted. I think there is a concern.
That concerns me because when we say that, it makes it sound like it's simplicity for who? The adults? I mean, I'm more worried about a realistic trend line for a teacher to be able to look at and decide where intervention needs to come in. Maybe I'm looking at it wrong, but I'm not understanding that because the 2 years, to me, when you look at it in a band, it's going to skew the data. If I have a student who thrives with a teacher, it's going to go up extreme, which is great. But if it goes the other way, it's going to have the same opposite effect. In the meantime, they look like a ping pong ball going through, and I want to see a longer trend line of growth to really get a fix on how they're doing. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm curious as to what the conversation with ADEP is, because I hope it's not just simplicity for the sake of we can just get 2 years and do it. I really want us to think through what's in the best interest of the student. But maybe I'm not fully understanding that.
I do have a question though too, concerning the research behind the brain theory, and between the grades of 6 and 8 there's a plateau. So the amount of growth over a two-year time period may be significantly low, and that's just because of all the research that says that they do plateau as for maturity. So I think I do agree with Brad that looking at it over that might adjust some of that.
Yes, Michelle?
I just, I wanted to just remind, if you all decide that it would be useful, that the board does continue to have its 2 expert consultants, Dr. Badabiner and Dr. Briggs, who would be able to provide, even come and talk with the board or send emails with research articles or memoranda that discuss these very issues. And their contracts remain good all the way through August as we have these conversations.
So in that last point up there, that talks about adaptive assessment. So when we couple, so I want to talk about coupling things together. So when we couple looking at 2 consecutive years of data for the trajectory growth piece, but we also couple it with adaptive assessments that actually show us where kids are performing. Then we have individual measurement that the student's going to see in their assessment data. But then we're also going to be able to look at assessment in a different way. Because it won't just be like a pass-fail to a pass-fail perhaps. We can actually see in the assessment itself growth of the student. Did I get that right? Is that what you're meaning in the last bullet?
That's correct. So with an adaptive assessment, Michelle, you may feel free to jump in and correct me on this. The information we get back is definitely very different than what we get right now. Currently, we get a pass-fail. So information that we can get back from an adaptive assessment, we may be able to get back, for example, what grade level they're actually performing at. So when we look at growth using this type of information, again, we can either look at spring to spring, so it's a 1 full year increment that we're looking at, and be able to tell if that student actually increased a full grade level. So did they go from a 3.4 to a 4.4? Or did they go from a 3.8 to a 4.2? And being able to look at it a little differently. Fall to spring would actually assess them only 1 school year. So assessing the student in the fall to establish a baseline, assessing the student in the spring as their actual achievement, but looking at the difference in those grade levels that they're performing at to be able to establish how much growth occurred over that year. So there are a lot of options that are available.
I was going to add too, I think it's important to think about the distinction between what we have to report out for NCLB, where all students in an adaptive assessment would be taking items within their actual blueprint that are on grade level. Could we build into the assessment other pieces where we go off grade level? We could, but just so everyone's aware that we do have to measure on grade level content, knowledge and skills and abilities to report out.
So if we wanted to measure reading lexiles, for instance, then we could decide whether we wanted to do that from a spring to a spring, or we wanted to do that from a fall to a spring in a particular year to see growth. Okay.
That's correct. And that is, I'm sorry, let me back up to performance for a minute and touch on the reading lexile. That is something that the accountability panel had been discussing as well, as having that information come back as a lexile to be able to inform teachers where that student is performing. Utilizing a lexile and not necessarily a pass-fail type reading back for those students. And as it's not included in our federal accountability and not required, we do not have to follow the same guidelines for reading that we do for English language arts and math, testing on grade level and reporting back to the feds on grade level.
Are you looking at embedding that in the assessment piece that currently is in place versus having a separate assessment
Do you mean for reading?
for reading?
Well, that's up for us to talk about.
I think that's part of the chart
Reading's not
piece.
required by the federal government, so if we wanted to put in a different type of reading assessment, we could. Or if we want to embed it within the state assessment piece that we want to give, we could do that also. We also could do something different for grades 1 and 2 than we do for 3 through 8. So it's up for dialogue.
And I guess finally back to your point, Brad, in fact, Debbie and I have a conversation scheduled with Dr. Badabenner tomorrow afternoon to specifically talk about trajectory growth, and we're looking at multiple ways to actually bring that back to the panel, being able to show, well, here's what happens if we use this, here's what happens if we use this. So, point well taken.
And that is one of the components that we are discussing is how many years worth of data.
Just really quickly, and we talked about grades 3 through 8, yeah.
I just would ask too, since you mentioned you're gonna be talking to him, I'd like to hear more from him too at some point about how the decision to do an adaptive assessment, because I get that, and we did, when I was in central office, we did NWA for years, and the adaptive test helps you get through the test, actually, quite honestly, sooner rather than later, and to get you to a growth score, so I get that. My concern is if you're trying to achieve proficiency, what is the impact on that, trying to get valid and reliable data back? I don't know, I just know enough to ask the question. I'd like to hear from the experts on the impact of an adaptive test to running those metrics to get to a number.
Sure.
So if you could just ask that, put
Absolutely.
that on the list.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
No problem. I think back to the point that Michelle made, we have to assess on grade level.
Yeah.
But then we can go beyond that to really see where a student is performing and get both measures.
So that was grades 3 through 8 that we talked about. Grades 9 through 11, I just want to make sure that everyone here is aware that currently we do not actually have a way of measuring true growth at the grades 9, 10, 11 level, because the measure that we use is the 10th grade end of course assessment, which is actually looked at by the end of 10th grade. And it's not really aligned with the 8th grade I-STEP. So what we've done as kind of a stopgap measure is look at the change in percentage of students passing in 8th grade versus 10th grade. It's obviously not ideal, but we wanted some measure of growth to be there. But what we're actually looking at is probably being able to have a true measure of growth. And I think that this has been probably agreed on by the panel that, at least wanting a 9th and 10th grade assessment, possibly and maybe even probably an 11th grade assessment, which would actually allow us to measure growth in much the same way that we measure growth for grades 3 through 8. I know we've gotten a lot of feedback and pushback from high schools that are a little frustrated with the way that we measure growth, which isn't really growth, it's basically change in passing percentage. And so I think this is going to be something that's very important to think about. And then in addition, thinking about kind of those measures of college and career readiness and the possibility of, say, an 11th grade assessment actually measuring college and career readiness in a way. So what has been recommended for high school is using growth calculations in much the same way as we talked about for grades 3 through 8. But again, this is something that will be very important for you to consider in terms of our ability to actually measure growth with currently only having a 10th grade assessment that is actually an end of course assessment. So that really concludes our presentation and where we are with the panel. I do think that the timing of everything is pretty perfect, in terms of the new standards, the accountability panel, and then the work of the assessment committee. Other things that we'll probably need to keep in mind, and this is not necessarily associated with your work as the assessment committee, but I know in states that have adopted college and career ready assessments, they have tended to see drops or lowered performance because it's a brand new test. We even saw that in I-STEP when we moved from fall to spring assessments. So I think as a board, we'll need to really kind of talk about and think about, what does that mean for accountability in terms of, the types of sanctions that are associated with certain grades over a number of years. And that's down the road, but it's just something that, I think Debbie and I would like you to keep in the back of your minds, as you move forward with this work.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, exploring the assessments and the current reality and how a test is created, I will tell you, Michelle is truly an expert, because now she's going to get into some technical things, because creating an assessment is a very technical aspect. She created for you another chart. It's called Exploring Required Assessments. She put them on a one-page kind of piece here for you to look at, so that you could see them at a glance. And so I think she wants to just briefly touch on that. Last time we went into detail about which vendors were doing which, and we had some dialogue, and I think she just wants to point out a couple of things and then talk about really the role of actually creating an assessment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Superintendent Ritz. So the 2 pages, what I did, as Superintendent Ritz described, is took really the information that was more in a narrative handout that you received at our orientation meeting and put it into a graphic organizer in the form of a chart, just to give you a kind of a bird's eye view of basically what your charge is as a group. So for example, 1004 is requiring us to have a kindergarten readiness assessment, so I added that to the list. And I won't go through and read these to you. What I would like for you to do is take a look at those, and if you have questions, we can talk about them either today or the next time we meet. I just kind of want to make sure you're aware of what are the required assessments and why are those required, and then the second half of the second page is the additional assessments that we currently have, that you may find value in rolling that into a larger assessment. For example, if we had a fall and a spring assessment, do you want the fall assessment to give diagnostic information?
Do you have an extra second page?
Sure, I'll send that around.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
You may.
The Because this is titled as required assessments, and then under exploring other assessments, those are not currently required though, correct?
Right.
They're just available options.
Right, they're ones
Okay.
that we currently offer, but they're not required.
Okay.
Any other quick questions? Again, it's just another way to look at the information, but,
I
go
know,
ahead, Brad.
Okay, so.
I noticed that, in the acuity, it doesn't have predictive. I know we have that option as well.
Right, we do. We definitely have, within our diagnostic suite, we have both diagnostic and predictive. Yeah, definitely.
Just a quick question on the,
Mhm.
back to what Sarah was on the others. I understand those aren't required. Are we providing any kind of funding as a part of what we spend now on that? So if
Yes.
the district chooses to give that, so it's a part of the pool right now that's currently
Yes.
being tapped from a financial resource like that.
And do you remember the graphic I gave you last time that started at the bottom with, as a board, your current assessment system? So that includes all of the costs associated with everything that's on that list. Yeah. Well, let's turn our attention to, you should have a copy of a PowerPoint. It was called Assessment Life Cycle. And what I wanted to do today was try to walk you through kind of what our work is once we head down this path in terms of, I guess I'll call it kind of the technical side or the complexity pieces. And I mean, please stop me at any time. This is very informal, but it's a lot of information. So if I'm going too fast or you want to ask questions, you know, don't hesitate to interrupt. First I need to, is it the right? Yes, okay. Just had to get a quick lesson. So one thing, and some of you would be aware of this if you either know someone or you yourself have worked with us on any of our assessment committees or any of our work. It's always a collaborative effort with the Department of Education, educators across the state, and whomever the vendor happens to be for that particular program. So with all of the assessments that we currently offer, it is very much a collaborative relationship that we have that starts at the very beginning of what should this assessment look like, what information do we want to provide to teachers, and goes from there. So what I want to do with this particular drawing, I call it the journey, from item specifications to the operational test. And within this journey, there are two boxes that actually have blue ink in them, or blue font. And that's where we're involving teachers. So I do want to kind of walk through this with you and see if you have questions about what these look like. And then I'm going to talk in more detail about what are item specifications, because those are the things, for example, where teachers actually describe the type of vocabulary that we use in items. So I'm going to get a little bit more in the weeds, but I want to start with a high-level overview. So the first thing we do is actually design what the specifications, limits, and test blueprint is going to be, because that informs the item development. So we don't write any items until we know what is it that are specs and limits, and I'll get into that explanation in just a moment, and our blueprint. So what % of our blueprint is read comprehension, what % is you know, literary text, and so on. Then we actually have professional item writers write the items to the specifications. And again, teachers across the state, and you've heard me talk about our cells before, where we actually identify educators that fit into these groups that are the north, central, south, the urban, rural, suburban, and the high and low poverty. So an attribute from each of those makes a cell. So I won't go back to that explanation, but just to make sure you're aware that all the committees that are in the very beginning are made up of this representative group from the cells. So professional item writers go and use the specifications and limits that we've described through our educator groups and the content specialists at DOE, and then they bring those items back for us to review. So the first thing that happens is the very last box in the top row. And that's where actually my staff reviews those items for alignment. Did they actually follow the specifications we had provided? It's a first check. And then even more importantly is when we actually bring in our educators for the first box on the second row on the right. So bias and sensitivity, and we talked about this somewhat when we even talked about our standards, making sure our standards are free of bias. and that they're not advantaged to one group or another. And so we do that with all the items as well. And the content review is extremely important because we're looking at, is this matching the alignment of the standard for that grade level? And has it been worded appropriately? Does it match classroom practice? And I'll talk a little bit more about content review.
So
in
I
just a
want to,
moment.
I just want to
Oh.
clarify something. So Indiana has always followed this process
Yes.
because we've always created our own test.
Right.
So it wouldn't be like we would choose a vendor and then say, give us your test.
Right.
We always, whatever vendor we
Mhm.
choose, we say, we're making our own test. And so
We have always
what
done
you're
that.
explaining now is the process of how we go about making our own
Right.
test, once the vendor is chosen.
Right.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Question.
Yeah, oh, yes.
So this is the way it's always been done. Is there, I mean, is one of our options to say, what questions do you already have, and you get to choose,
Mhm.
like the DOE's, starting really skipping the item development, they're developed, and then going to the internal IDOE review where you review them and say, these align, these are already created, and not starting from
It
the
could be,
beginning.
it could be. Always in the past, Indiana has owned the items, and we've talked about this a little bit, I think, last time when we were together. Moving forward, I think, vendors will probably lease items. You wouldn't necessarily have to own them as a state. So I think it's gonna be really interesting to see what our RFI and our RFP.
But even if the vendor has had items, we've been known to change how
yeah,
they're
to
worded.
tweak them.
Right.
So, but you're right, we have something to look at when we start.
We would probably, back to your question, Carrie, I think we would still want to do the first part, I think, because we would use that as our lens to see whether or not the items that we received, say from a shelf product or from a vendor, actually met our criteria.
I want to ask this
Yeah.
because I can't remember, and I don't have a hard copy RFI, I can pull it up, but when I was reviewing the RFI, does the RFI leave open the possibility for them to speak to during the vendor presentations how they might offer in terms of how we've always done it, just in terms of thinking differently about test design? Or does it basically ask them to align to this already?
No.
No.
I mean, when Michelle and I put together the draft for board and DOE staff review, we really tried to make it very open, because we don't want to close down any, close any windows or doors on what they might have to offer, so.
And I don't want anybody to read anything into that, I'm just saying, with us talking about differences in
Right.
proficiency and growth and adaptation,
Mhm.
I wouldn't want to box them in. I don't
Right.
think we did, but I want.
I'm trying to really give you some background knowledge right now, I think.
What's
It's more
that?
than anything.
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
trying to build your knowledge, kind of assessment literacy, if you will. So, sure. So we send the items through the review process, the biosensitivity and content review, which I do want to come back to in a little bit. And then actually select the items that we want to move forward with. Then there are actually two paths that we can take. The purple arrows are what we typically have done with iStep. The blue or gray, I'm not sure what color that looks like up there, but I'll call it gray for lack of a better color here. That arrow actually is how we have done IMAST, for example, where we actually created an operational pilot. In the purple arrows, it's important to note that we actually do not pilot those items in the purple realm with every student. We use a statistical sample, and you might remember book 2, or you've had students maybe at your school. Troy, you probably remember whether or not you've actually given some of these, and probably Carrie and Sarah do too. So the statistical sample is identified in conjunction with the research scientists or the psychometricians at our vendors. So it's it's making sure that we're actually doing what's called a diff analysis and really looking at all the populations of students on every item. So without getting into detail, again, in the purple area, we would pilot the items and then create the formal operational test from those that would statistically survive. That takes about 18 to 24 months. So that's something to keep in mind, I think, as we're thinking about what we want to do moving forward. The gray arrow, or I wanted it to be blue, but I guess it's gray. That particular arrow actually is what's called an operational pilot. That's where we could do a census test. That takes about 10 to 12 months to develop to get to that point. So there are some ideas that we have moving forward just to share with you as a, helping you kind of know where we're thinking as I go through the presentation. But there are two paths. Both of them are widely acceptable in the industry. Just want to make you aware of them. The next slide is actually to start getting into the weeds a little bit and talking more now about an overview, and I'll go into a little bit detail on each of these, but what is an item specification? What does that mean? What is a limit? And we start with our standards, and we're going to kind of go through each step around this circle as I go through the next several slides. So you might be familiar with depth of knowledge, or DOK. This is from Norman Webb. He's very well known in the alignment of assessments and standards and all things in that nature. DOK is similar to Bloom's taxonomy, so teachers, I think, are familiar with this. When teachers come to work on item review, or they're helping us with our blueprint and our item specs, it's fairly easy for us to train them quickly on what DOK is if they're unfamiliar. Unlike Bloom's that has more levels, this one has 4, but I think you can get the idea here, that we go everywhere from recall to extended thinking. What we do with the item specifications is when we're talking about DOK, one of the things we try to make sure everyone is familiar with is that complexity and difficulty aren't the same thing. So it might be hard to name all the states and capitals right now at my age, but it's not very complex. So, but please don't ask me to do it because I won't be able to right now. So really looking and helping teachers understand what is the difference between complexity and difficulty. And then really getting at what is the thinking involved? What's the metacognition that students must use to be able to respond to these items or to answer questions that are a particular DOK level. Then we actually, for each standard, we used to do this by indicator, so I'll change my slide to say standard here. But for each standard, is it a 0, 1, 2, or 3 in terms of importance? Is this standard one that students absolutely must know or they won't be successful moving to the next level of learning? Is it important? Is it introductory? Or is that something maybe that should be at the classroom in terms of assessment? A good example of that would be speaking and listening right now. So those would be 0s, not because they're not important, but because they are classroom assessed. The other standards were, again, trying to assign a priority in terms of how essential are they to students' future learning, whether that's within the same grade level or course, or for future learning beyond that grade level or course. Then selecting the type of item, and many standards actually can have multiple item types, and that's the best really, because then, like a writing prompt, for example, is going to be extended response. So measuring writing, we can do some measuring of writing through multiple choice, but having students write is the best way for us to assess whether or not they are good writers. So there are particular item types that seem to suit particular standards well, but any item type that is appropriate for a standard is actually listed in the blueprint. You'll notice I added technology enhanced items because now that's coming onto the scene, so that now will be a part of what we can do with our blueprint. The specifications and the limits, and I'm going to give you an example of each of these in just a moment. So this is really where we're trying to have the educators identify for us, for our vendor, so they can go back and make sure that the professional item writers know what are we really intending for students to learn or to know and be able to do with this particular standard. So it's at the standard level. It's a lot of really great PD, frankly, when teachers come to these meetings, because it's really getting into the weeds of the standard and what are we looking for in terms of student learning, what would be evidence of student learning for this standard. Describing appropriate ways to assess it. Kind of back to the item types, but also, are there multiple ways of assessing this? Do we also assess this in the classroom? And we want to make sure that we model as much as we can what happens with instruction. The next one is really important, the appropriate language and vocabulary. So Indiana educators, Department of Education content specialists actually determine what the language and vocabulary of those items are going to be. So if there's a word that Indiana students really zone in and they know that word, they know what that means, and it's appropriate to the standard. That might be a word, and I can't think of a good example right now, but I'll think of one. But that might be a word that we want to include. Or there might be a word that we think our students don't know. Should they learn that? Is that something they should actually learn as part of instruction? Or should we replace it with a word that's more appropriate for Indiana? So this is, you've heard me say Indiana size, which I know is not a word, but I like that one because we basically are Indiana sizing the different items. We establish content limits, which you'll see an example of in a moment. And we definitely want to provide examples of some context. So not every computation problem should be straight computation. Some of those are in the context or a word problem. Some of them are actually straight computation. It depends on what we're measuring. Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Brett.
Just on the test construction part, Michelle, you may know this or know where we find this. Is there anything in the research that tells us what an appropriate mix is? I understand why we have multiple choice versus open-ended, but with each decision we make on the specs, length of test gets impacted, how much time it takes to get the test back. I've always wondered about that, and I know it's always been looked at, but is there any compelling research one way or the other, or is that something that we could ask our experts to give us? Because that's one of the things I hear from parents is there anything we can do to cut down on the length of this assessment administration, and yet when you start getting to certain kind of test items, it's going to, by logistic default,
Right.
going to expand the test. So
I think, you know, one of the things that we could probably talk about as a group moving forward with this committee is, like, what is the percentages now? What's the percent of, say, open-ended versus multiple choice? What is it now? What was it when we had a fall test? Why did we change it? I mean, I think some of that background might be really helpful for you. And what does the research say about how many items do you need to actually measure a construct with, you know, reliability? Yeah, we can definitely talk through some of those things. That would be helpful, I think.
Along with that,
Oh.
you know, I think that some questions measure more than one standard.
Yes, we have, that is a challenge sometimes on many levels, but we have had items before that are reported to more than one reporting category or more than one standard. The challenge with that is that the student is double dinged if they miss it.
Sure.
So we try not to do that, to be honest with you, but it is something that we can do. We've had items where we're measuring, like our open-ended math items, though, are a good example of two standards because we measure a content and a process.
Sure.
So that, I think, is a good way of having one item that measures two, because they just naturally go together rather than two separate standards. Those are more, I'll say, married together. So a specification, and again, there's specs and there are limits. So specs or specification is the actual word. This is additional information that actually informs development. So for example, let's say we were asking students to multiply and divide whole numbers, and the educators might say, well, we want to make sure that if we have any word problems, there are no remainders, because we just want to know, can they actually figure out how many buses or whatever the item might be for the future. So this is an example of some specificity that we're putting around the item that's going to be developed for this particular standard. This is, again, where it's really critical that the DOE content specialists and the educators working on the committee identify any words that they prefer or do not prefer, and making sure that these sound like what our Indiana standards should be assessing.
Can I ask a question on the
Sure.
rubric? I
Sure.
know the grading rubric, is it developed before the assessment question or after?
The rubric is developed before, and actually now that our standards have been developed, one of the things we'll be doing is revisiting all of our rubrics. And we always want to know what those rubrics are before items are written to them. That's an excellent question.
Thank you.
Part of that long process.
Yes.
A limit is, I'll call it a parameter. They are actually called item parameters. Let's say we were, again, same content, multiplication, division of whole numbers, but the teachers identified in this example that division could be up to a maximum of a 4-digit divided by a 2-digit, or for multiplication, a 2-digit by a 3-digit. That's called a limit. That says we are not going to go more complex than this on this particular content piece. The specification is more about exactly what we're looking for. The limit is how far can we go with this concept. And this is just kind of a quick snapshot of a blueprint, because once we combine all the information we've just been talking about in the last several slides, it forms a blueprint, and we actually do that in the presence of the educators because we want them to make sure that we have captured appropriately how important each standard should be to the blueprint, so that we haven't given, overemphasized a particular standard that really is not that important at that grade level. So to summarize, what I did here was just kind of tried to list for you, again, the involvement of the Indiana educators, looking at the depth of knowledge for the particular standards. How important are they? Are they essential is it essential students learn this? Is that something that's classroom assessment? What item type or types would be appropriate? Are there any specifications on that particular standard and or limits? And then what % of our blueprint should be that standard? The content review, and this is always, again, another really good professional development opportunity for teachers. This, you might remember, was in the lower right corner of our flow chart. This is where, once the professional item writers draft the items, make the items, create those, and our staff has looked at alignment, then we bring the items to the educators and say, here's what the items look like, let's review these. Are they aligned to the standard that we said they would be aligned to? So it's very specific. If this item is written to standard 5.1, for example, we're looking at that, not just, oh, does it match Indiana? I mean, it's very specific, because again, these need to be valid and reliable assessments. So we check for alignment. We also make sure that it's the appropriate grade level, because some of, especially in ELA, many of the content pieces are measured in multiple grade levels. And it's just a degree of how complex or how, to what degree, maybe in terms of depth, that we're actually assessing students. So reading comprehension is all the way through the grades, obviously. So we make sure that the way that the item has been worded, it is grade appropriate. And the difficulty range, because we're looking at anywhere from easy to medium to difficult items. We do need a mix, and so we're also looking at if the item writer tagged this as a difficult item, do we agree with that? Or do we think this is an easy item for this grade level? The clearly stated and unambiguous is very important. This is where, again, we take a look at the language. Does the language match what we were expecting? Will students know exactly what we want them to do, so that we are really trying to determine how much they know, not whether or not they can figure out what we're asking. So it's really, really important. And then again, making sure that we've assigned the appropriate level, depth of knowledge, because we do want a mix of DOK on the test. We don't want, again, all easy items, all hard items. We do want a mix. So one of the things that we knew we had to do was enhance our I-STEP, because we did have, well, this is kind of back to last time, talking about the two masters that we're serving right now this year during our transition, which is the state requirement to administer I-STEP and our federal requirement to make sure we're giving kids access to college and career readiness items. And so we've taken our I-STEP, and you might remember we changed the name of that in December to I-STEP/College and Career Ready Transition Assessment. And the I-STEP, as we're looking at it for spring of 15, would actually include accountability items and then items that would be assessing our new standards. So we would give students the opportunity with no stakes attached, I'll talk about that in just a moment, an item from our new standards, technology enhanced, so we're giving them exposure without having it be a part of teacher evaluation, student evaluation, or anything of that nature. So it's really a dual purpose. And what I put on this slide here, just kind of wanted to walk you through opportunity to learn versus really holding students accountable. And so in 14-15, we know our students are going to be learning our new standards. We've adopted them today. They're going to be a very high priority for 14-15. And we want to make sure we give access to students and adults, frankly, to see these college and career ready items for our new standards, but have no stakes attached to them. So that's the spring of 15. The 15-16 school year is the assessment that this committee is actually working on very diligently right now, getting ready to send out our RFI. So students would, again, have opportunity to learn these new standards. So this would be their second year in a row to be learning the new standards, and then they would be held accountable for those on the spring assessment, the summative assessment in spring of 16.
Thank you, Michelle, and I'm going to take your question in just a second, but I want to have a more robust conversation about transition. So we'll take a quick break after Sarah's question, if you don't mind, and then we'll get into transition, unless that's what your question's about.
It's just a clarification. For the spring 2015 administration, it's one test that includes both
Mhm.
components. Okay, thank you.
All right, let's take a quick, maybe 10-minute break and come back?
Sure.
Okay, that would be great.